Mark chapter 8 is where we're going to be this morning. And it's a little bit of a review in the sense that a few weeks ago we saw in chapter 6, actually starting in verse 31. Verse 31 of Mark chapter 6. Mark told us about the time that Jesus fed a multitude of people by multiplying 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. You remember that story, right? But did you know that Jesus did this twice? The account in chapter 6 typically, it's referred to as the feeding of the 5,000. But what we're going to see in our text this morning is the feeding of the 4,000. Now, there are those that will look at the Bible and they look at things like this and they go, see, the Bible's full of error. See, the Bible's just a hodgepodge of stuff. You can't take it literally. You can't take it seriously. And even though the stories are similar, and it's easy to assume that the same events are being talked about here, but as we go through verse by verse here, we're going to see that there are several distinctions. There is no question about this being a separate story and being something that truly happened. Now, Mark wouldn't tell the same story twice. There'd be no benefit to that, no purpose in that. Very unlikely that this was an error. Mark got his material, his source was Peter, as we've talked about several times as we, examined Mark and just talked about the book in general. Peter was the one that he interviewed. He heard a lot of these stories from Peter. And so the facts wouldn't be wrong. Peter was there. Now, this event takes place in a region that's predominantly Gentile. The previous one in chapter 6 took place in Galilee. And so we can't know the exact demographics of the crowds for sure, but we do know that Jews and Gentiles pretty much didn't mix very well. So it's reasonable to assume that this event that we're going to talk about this morning was attended by mostly Gentiles, unbelievers. Whereas the Galilee event was attended mostly by Jews. Now, both events were likely greater than they seemed, and we talked about this extensively when we were in chapter 6, how that verse 41 tells us, now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. This is chapter 6, verse 41. And so from that, we can see that only the men were counted. It's very possible that in mentioning the 4,000 that were, that received this miracle here in this chapter, it's the same thing, that only the men are being counted, only the men are spoken of. And so there could have been upwards of, 15, 20,000 individuals when you count the wives and the kids that were present. And we know that there were kids present because there was at least one kid in the last story, the one that was the supplier of the loaves and the fish. And so as we go through our text this morning, we're going to do a little bit of comparing as well as talk about the things that we see here in the text. So starting at verse 1, Mark chapter 8, he says, in those days. Now what days? Well, he's referring to the days that he's speaking of here in this part of his gospel, where Jesus' ministry was booming. There were multitudes that followed him everywhere. And not only were there the multitudes that were coming to get a miracle, that were coming to get healed, but there was a multitude of people that followed Jesus that considered themselves disciples. So there were the 12. We know from another story that there were 72 that he sent out on a mission trip. And then there were thousands that followed, thousands that considered themselves disciples. And so this is the height, I'll say, as far as this phase of his ministry, this was the height of it. Of course, we know that the whole crux of everything was the cross. But as far as him reaching people, as far as the work that's being done here on earth, he's at the height of it. And so in those days, The multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. Now back in chapter 6, we're told by Mark that the account of the feeding, the 5,000, it began with Jesus having compassion. And so we see this as an important thing. This is an important lesson that we can extract from these accounts. He was moved with compassion. Now in chapter 6, the situation was that Jesus and the disciples were looking to get away, have a little R&R. The ministry work was grueling. And so it's cool to see that Jesus places great emphasis on rest. But we also see here that he was so moved by the condition of the people that he could not rest and just do nothing. Jesus sacrificed what he needed for the sake of providing for the people. The objective was to rest, but there was work to be done at that moment. And I think that this is a huge lesson for us. Huge lesson. Because how many times do we go about our day and something happens? And if you really think about it, and sometimes we think about it in hindsight and we go, oh man, but we see that the Lord gave us the perfect setup to share the gospel. Or he brings us somebody that has a need, but we're too busy, we're too consumed with other things to stop and take time out and address the need of that person. We don't see that example in Jesus. In Jesus, come on, if anybody was spiritually busy, it was Jesus. If anyone had to accomplish things and had an itinerary, it was Jesus. You know how it is. I get this as a pastor all the time. People come to me and they say, oh, pastor, you're just too busy. I won't bother you with this thing. And I'm like, well, why am I busy? I'm busy because I like to meet the needs of people as much as I possibly can. At least I want the opportunity to pray with people. And sometimes I think we feel that way about God himself. Oh, he's too busy for my problems. But we need to understand that he is moved with compassion for each and every one of us. He cares about your situation. He cares about the things that you go through. He wants to be God. He wants to provide. He wants to love you. And we, likewise, should be that way towards the people that God puts in our life. And there's the people that God has put in our life as far as our relatives, our children, our mates, all of those people we know God has put in our lives. But what about the stranger? Just even a simple thing, like you find yourself in an elevator with somebody. Have you ever just thought, well, how can I share the gospel with this person in the 30 seconds that I'm going to be riding up in an elevator with them? How can I say something encouraging? How can I get their mind on God? And that's a fun challenge sometimes, but I believe that God puts us in those situations for that reason. Honestly, I do. And we all need to take note of our surroundings and not be too busy. Honestly, don't you guys encounter people? Sometimes, you Monday morning, tomorrow morning, we're all going to go to work and we're going to be like, hey, how you doing? Oh, not too good. Oh, yeah, okay, well, that's great. I'll see you, bye. But have we ever stopped and said, well, what's going on with your life? Can I pray with you? Can I encourage you somehow? I'll never forget, there was a time when I was a very young Christian. I was probably months old in the Lord. And I was standing with my pastor and this other young guy who I didn't know. He was just there. And the pastor asked me, he says, hey, this guy really wants to know about the Lord, and I've been talking to him, and he goes, why don't you talk to him and pray with him? Perfect setup. And so I began to talk with the guy, and then the guy was kind of like, I don't know, he was being very apprehensive. And then he said, well, I got to go. And so I was like, hey, you coming back to church tonight? And he's like, yeah, whatever, And so I'm thinking, okay, well, we'll sit down and we'll definitely talk and we'll pray and we'll go through everything tonight, Never saw the guy again in my life. And I was excited about sharing the Lord with him. Wow, maybe I can get this guy to pray a prayer of repentance and all that. I had it all mapped out in my mind. But in hindsight, I realized that the opportunity to do that was then. The guy wasn't going to come back. Maybe if I had challenged him, maybe if I had pressed in more, if I had spent the time, but I was more distracted than he was and more anxious to leave and go have lunch with my buddies than he. More distracted than he was. And that's something that has always bugged me. And so again, I'm just throwing it out there for you guys. If you open your eyes, if you look around, and if you're always sensitive of what the Lord is doing, or even what the Lord might do, we should take advantage of those situations. We should be looking at everybody, looking at everything and going, okay, Lord, how can I use this for your glory? Lord, how can I encourage this person? Lord, how can I say something that this person, that would cause this person to put their mind on you and put their trust in you? We should always be doing that. And sobering as it is, as personal as some of you may take it, the reason why that doesn't happen is because we are not moved with compassion. Our faith is pretty much about us. Everything that we go through in God is, all for our benefit and all according to our criteria and our timetable. And we don't want anything interrupting. Even if it's somebody else's salvation, if it's somebody else's spiritual well-being, well, I don't have time for that. But we need to come out of that. We need to come away from that mindset. And we need to learn to spend time with people and pray that God would put that in us, that we're moved with compassion for people. Even our loved ones that are unsaved sometimes, it's like, yeah, we want them saved, but, how bad? Are you moved with compassion for the people in your family? Or are you just frustrated with them because they don't see things the way you see it? And when you see them, you kind of blast them with the gospel, and then after that, you just don't do anything. That's not being moved by compassion. But Mark says that Jesus saw these people as sheep with no shepherd. He saw them differently. They weren't just people. It wasn't just a distraction from what he was doing. He looked at them and he saw immediately the need and he was moved. And I shared this last time, when we were in Mark chapter 6, but, compassion basically means having your bowels yearn. That's what the Strong's Concordance says. Having your bowels yearn. I don't think about that so much in modern terms because, when we think bowels, we think of, what we think of. But it's really talking about your guts. It's talking about deep within you, you are yearning. Do you know what that feels like? To really yearn for something, to really long for something, to be absolutely consumed. That's what compassion is. Compassion is not merely doing a task, but it's a hunger, it's a thirst. And you got to ask yourself, do you feel that way about people that are lost? Do you look at this world and do you just grieve the things that are going on and the state that people are in? But we need to pray and ask the Lord to give us that. And in a sense, he's already given us that, and that he's filled us with his Spirit, which leads us, which gives us the mind and the heart of God. But that's what we need. And that's the reason why we don't typically spend a whole lot of time. And that's the reason why we don't get up in the morning and we're just going, God, where is it? Where's that opportunity? God, where's that situation? We go and order a breakfast sandwich. Are we thinking, man, how can I share with this guy behind the counter? Look at these people standing in line with me. God, what do you have for them? We need that. We absolutely need that. But again, he's moved by compassion for people. Jesus called his disciples, the text says, to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. Now, this is amazing that these folks went 3 days following Jesus, not thinking about food, not thinking about anything else except here's an opportunity to be with Jesus. And that's another thing. Not only should we be yearning for the lost, yearning to be a part of God's will, but are we yearning for Jesus himself that way? Are we yearning for God, for the things of God? Do you ever feel like you can't wait for the next opportunity to sit down and read your Bible? You ever feel like, wow, I just have to get away and just pray, or take time and just pray? Yeah, that's where these folks are at, man. 3 days. And Jesus said in verse 3, and if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. So not only did they stick around for 3 days, but some of them traveled a long way just to get there, and now they have to travel to get back home. Jesus had compassion, and note that his compassion not only compels him to meet the spiritual needs of the people, but he's concerned for their physical needs as well. And again, this is a pattern for all of us who minister. And yes, I am going to jump on my soapbox for just a second here and remind you of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, which you all should know by heart by now. Paul says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. And all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. In a nutshell, he's saying there that we are made new creations. We are saved so that we can be in the service of the Lord. He saved us so he can give us a ministry. And that ministry is the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself through, in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. And we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. We are all in the ministry. We have been saved to be in the ministry. We're not saved to just go on and have our own little thing, our own little corner, and not be worried about anyone else. We have been given the message of the gospel, the message of reconciliation, so that we can share with people that they too can be reconciled with God. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to stand up on a street corner and just preach the gospel all day long. That doesn't mean that you have to wait until you can get a pulpit of your own and preach to a church. That doesn't mean that you have to leave everything and go overseas and go on the mission field. But it means your life, your day-to-day activities, all of that should include the reconciliation of people to Christ. And that looks, like a lot of different things. There's no one thing that you can say that this is what it is. It could be anything. Again, the person at the sandwich counter, your coworker. It could be the mailman. It could be anybody. But we need to consider that. I feel very strongly about that. We're not saved to just sit around and just be wonderful, full, fat Christians. God has something for each and every one of us to accomplish. And it all revolves around the ministry of reconciliation that he's given us. We're not just saved for our own benefit. But verse 4, then his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? Now, I don't know about you, but are you wondering why the disciples, the people that walked with Jesus, that conversed with him, the people that left their homes, left their professions to be his disciples, why would they ask this question? And I guess even deeper, we know from our studies in Mark that twice they were about to perish at sea and they were saved by Jesus. Chapter 6, was the other account of him doing the same thing that he's getting ready to do now. So why in the world would they ask such a question? You would think that by now they would have finally learned that if Jesus is sending us, or if Jesus is present with us, then how can we fail? And it's not a matter of our assessment of the situation, but it should be us saying, okay, let's see what Jesus is going to do, and let's fall in line behind him. Let's work with him and do what it is that he wants. I mean, will he not provide? Will he not lead them? Will he not save them? And if things happen to go wrong anyhow, I mean, he's going to save. And the same thing in our lives. I mean, is he not going to provide for us? Is he just going to sit and watch us go down? No. Why are they questioning Jesus? I mean, if Jesus is thinking this, he must have a plan, right? So instead of butting in and saying, well, how can we possibly accomplish this? They should be going, okay, Jesus, tell us which direction you're going and tell us what you're doing. It's the same thing in chapter 6, and he began to teach the crowd many things. It says in verse 34 of chapter 6, and when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. Now, I suspect that they were really saying, hey, Jesus, it's getting late, we're tired, we're hungry, so why don't you send the crowd away so that we can get something to eat and get some rest? But the way they phrased it, they made it sound nice and spiritual. They made it sound as if they were compassionate for the people. But they're really not moved with compassion. They're moved for their own selfish gain. But why are they questioning Jesus? If this is what Jesus is thinking here, then they should be saying, Jesus has a plan. Let's wait and see what he's going to say. Let's wait and see what he's going to do. And in verse 5 in our text, he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. Now, John tells us that there was a small boy who was the source of the loaves and the fish that were used last time. And this young boy is mentioned by himself. He was mentioned alone. His parents aren't mentioned. And, the speculation is that, maybe they allowed this young boy to attend. And they packed a lunch for him to go, see Jesus. Kind of an interesting thought, especially for me, because I think of when I was a kid, my parents, they would always send us down the street to the Presbyterian church. They never went to church themselves, but every Sunday morning they'd get us up and dress us. And, back then in the Presbyterian, I guess they still do this, but we had that little box of envelopes. You remember that? And those of you that come from denominational churches, you get a little box of envelopes, and every week, they're numbered, and every week you put your offering in and you bring your little envelope. And we always had money in the envelopes, and, we get sent off to church. But I think it was really because my parents just wanted some quiet time on Sunday morning. And that's why they went through all of this, So I wonder if it was the same for this young boy. He's like, Mom, Dad, Jesus is in town. Yeah, okay, well, why don't you go? Here's a little lunch. Make sure you just stay out all day. Have a good time. It's also possible, because the amount of food that the young boy had could have fed 2 or 3 people. Maybe he was carrying the lunch packed for the whole family. We don't really know. The Bible doesn't really go into all of that. But the boy, my point here is that this boy was the source of the food the last time Jesus did this. But here in our text, there is no source for the food that's named here. And it's very possible that the disciples themselves, because they gathered up the remainder, they could have gathered up so much that they still had some of that food from that incident. These things, they probably would have been days apart. I don't believe that there was that much time between the 2 incidents. But it's kind of interesting because, the bread and the fish used this time was supplied by the disciples. And I'll comment a little bit more on that in just a little while. But verse 6, It says, so he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And they set them before the multitude. And in verse 7, they also had a few small fish. Now, this account, Mark mentions 7 loaves and an estimated amount of fish. He just says just a few. The other account, Mark specifically mentions 5 loaves and 2 fish. But verse 7, it says, they also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000. There were 12 baskets left over in chapter 6, seemingly 1 basket for each disciple. Here there are only 7 baskets, but the words rendered basket, and this is a minor point, but I think interesting nonetheless, the word rendered basket in chapter 6 is different from the word basket here in chapter 8. Now in chapter 6, it refers to a small personal-sized basket. A type of basket, according to some commentators, commentaries, it's a type of basket typically used by ancient Jews in that time. It's a little personal basket for your stuff. Here in chapter 8, the word used refers to a large bin, like a big storage container kind of a thing, or a hamper of some sort. So while these stories are similar, there's enough difference in the detail to distinguish here, And the takeaway from each story is essentially the same. We get from both stories that our Savior is motivated by compassion. We get from each story that the disciples, just like us unfortunately, are not naturally moved by compassion. But we need to learn this, and we need to step up our game, take example from what we see in Jesus. We see in both accounts that God can and will defy the laws of our world to provide what we have need of. Now, I think that's amazing, in a sense, God cheats. He's not locked into doing things according to the laws of physics or, for our benefit, he will go beyond the laws that govern this world, the natural laws of this universe. I think that's amazing. God will essentially stop at nothing to meet our need, to accomplish his purpose in our lives. I think that's comforting. Both stories are a great lesson on having faith and trusting God. But one huge difference is that the first time that this was done, these things happened, the disciples weren't prepared for it, and it opened their eyes to a few things. It revealed the lack of faith, and it revealed the lack of compassion in the disciples. It revealed that they don't fully understand the things of God. And this was something that was just glaring. And the way Mark arranges the stories, the way Mark tells the things that happened during Jesus' life on earth, during his ministry, they are not in a strict chronology. They're not necessarily in order, but the thing is that he arranges it by subject. There's something that he wants to relay here. And so that's why in these last several chapters, we've seen the stories about, them in the boat. First they were in the boat. Jesus is with them, but he's sleeping, and the storm is raging, and they're all running around bailing water out and thinking that they're going to perish. And finally, they wake up Jesus, and he stands up and just goes, "Peace, be still." That pointed out a lack of faith, a lack of trust. It pointed out that the disciples were still stuck in that mode where they wanted to do everything on their own, by their own hand, instead of trusting God. Then it happens again, They're out in the boat, and they're rowing, and they're not going anywhere, and the storm is just blaring against them, and here comes Jesus walking across the water, and Jesus walks past them. Real curious story. He walks past the boat. And the reason is because he was waiting for them to cry out to him. Waiting for them to stop moping and crying and weeping, thinking that they're going to perish, and trust him and cry out to him. And again, the lesson is that if Jesus sent them, if Jesus commanded them to go, if this is what God's will is, then why would they think that they're going to perish? Just like in our lives, when the storms are blowing and all these things are happening and we think, oh man, this is it. A lot of people in those situations, they start to doubt God. They leave the faith. They abandon their faith. Because they think, oh man, here I am going through all of this hardship and God is doing nothing. My prayers aren't working. Nothing's happening here. But if you're in God's hands, if you're in God's will, why would you think that he would let you perish? Why do you think that things are going to go so wrong that everything is just going to be over? I mean, everything that God does is for a reason. In fact, we can even say even the things that God doesn't do are for a reason. Wednesday nights, not long ago, we went through the book of Job. Man, and that was the whole lesson. Here's a guy that's blessed. We can all get with the blessing that Job had, the riches that Job had. But as he had all that stripped away from him, his health and his family was gone, a lot of his kids, were killed. He went through this tremendous hardship, but he wasn't any less in the will of God than he was when he was prosperous. He wasn't any less a man of God. He had no less favor. And sometimes it's hard to wrap our heads around it. But we need to understand that whatever is happening is God's will. Whether God is directly doing it or whether God is allowing it to happen. And so whenever we go through things, we need to take the position that, hey, if God is allowing this, he must have a plan. He must have a plan. If I don't see God panicking, why should I panic? If I don't see God going, oh my goodness, this is really bad. Oh, wow, how did that happen? God's not doing that, is he? So we need to trust. We need to have faith. And again, these two stories it's the same lesson. The first time they realized that, hey, God had a plan here. We're thinking in the natural. We're thinking that we're going to have to take a year's worth of wages and go somehow and buy enough food to feed this multitude of people. And so they're complaining and they're saying, how could this happen? God, what do you expect us to do? But God doesn't need a store. God doesn't need money. In fact, he doesn't even need a sufficient amount of food. In fact, if there were no little boy with fishes and loaves, God could have produced the food out of thin air. You remember in the Old Testament, God actually had food raining down from heaven. Something called manna. God actually caused these quails to come and fly low to the ground, where all you had to do was just go and just grab one. God can do anything. He's not limited by the laws of this universe, and he certainly isn't limited by human ability. So we look at things and we're judging things according to human ability, but God is outside of that. God is beyond that. God doesn't need, to move according to these limitations. And so the first time a multitude of people were fed in this manner, they should have said, wow, we're thinking too small. We're thinking, very closed-minded here. We're not trusting God. And then the second time it happens, it really is a test, isn't it? Same setup just about. They should have recognized from the onset that this is what God was going to do. They should have already been prepared. Okay, look, let's just go ahead and give God a loaf of bread or something so he can do his thing, because this is what he did last time. And we know that he's moved with compassion, and we know that he's going to meet the needs of these people. So what does our opinion matter? Let's just see what God is going to do. So it was a test for the disciples to see if they actually got the point from the last time, from the other events that were happening even. And surely you would have thought that somebody would have said that. Hey, Jesus, what are you going to do? You going to do the same thing you did last time? They should have been prepared. But it's real sad here that they were just as unbelieving, that they were just as ignorant, just as astonished when it happened as they were the first time. And the other lesson, the thing that I want to elaborate on here is that, the first time the source of the food was the little boy. But this time, and I think that this is an important difference, this time the disciples were required to give themselves. Not use somebody else's substance to do the work of God, but they were to provide personally, to give of their own substance. And I think that this is an important lesson too, because sometimes, ministry can be easy because it's all somebody else's. Somebody else is doing all the hard work, somebody else is doing all the preparation, and we can just step in and just be ministers. But it's a different story when it costs your own money. It's a different story when it takes your own time to sit and labor over these things and get the will of God and to actually do it. It's different when you have to actually roll up your sleeves to make something happen. It's a lot different. And I totally live this because, so many pastors that I know, they have these sweet gigs where, they work for denominations basically, or they work for a church that's been established for years and years and years. And so you get hired on, you become part of staff, you don't have to worry about bills. You don't have to worry about what's going on here. You're not really stressing over who's joining the church and who's leaving the church and all of those things. You're not thinking about that because you have an office. You come in and you sit down at your desk. And you go out and do ministry, somebody else labored to build this big church, and now you just kind of step out and just do your thing. It's a different thing. And I'm not belittling that, different calls, different things that people are called to, different circumstances that people are in. But so many times, when I explain why I do what I do, this is what God has called me to do. At least for this season, this is what God has called me to do. And it's been a long season. It's been, 18 years, I think, since we started? And the church has been bigger at times. Church has gone through periods where it was much more exciting than it is now, but it's pretty much the same thing. And I don't have a problem with it, because this is what God has called me to do. But to explain it to other people, they're like, why in the world are you there? Why are you doing that? You can go get a gig. In fact, one of the Calvary pastors in New York recently left. He closed his church, went on staff. Some church out in the West somewhere. It just depends on what you're called to do and what you perceive God is doing. But, it's about trusting God. Things don't always line up, with what people's expectations are. Things don't always go according to our plan. Things don't always work in a way where we're able to do the things that we perceive God calling us to, or meet the needs of a situation that we're placed in. Sometimes it's beyond our ability. But that's the point. We need to trust God for everything. Even the things that God has commanded us to do, we ought to be trusting God in order to be able to fulfill it. And we ought to be using our own substance. We should be using our own energy. We should be laboring ourselves. sacrificing personally for the work of God, and again, it goes back to that compassion, because I tell you, I feel that compassion for what I do, for you guys, for this whole church thing that we have. I mean, I am moved with compassion. I love it when we are able to touch people. And, most of you guys don't even see all of the stuff that goes on. I mean, this church does bear fruit. This ministry is bearing fruit, but we don't see it because, we're not seeing droves of people come in on Sunday mornings and get saved and all that kind of stuff. We're not seeing that. But, if you put anything in the offering box, it's a part of the things that we are doing that, when we reach out to people. Your presence here is important. Your prayers are important. All of those things are part of what God is doing through this ministry. I mean, it's just amazing. It really is just amazing, the things that we do and the people that we touch. And I hope you guys understand that and appreciate that, But this is what God has called us to do. This is our own thing here. And you know what? God also is requiring of us personally put in to the work that goes on here. And even things that go on in your own life, God is calling you personally to put in. And we are a resource. The church as a whole is a resource to you guys. If you need anything, you need Bibles, you need anything because of the people you are ministering to outside of here, we're a resource. But also you need to understand that, there are times when God is requiring you. Man, I bought so many people Bibles, people that don't come here, people that live all over the country, buy them a Bible. If somebody needs a Bible, buy a Bible. What's the big deal? Buy people videos, buy people booklets, everything that helps them in the things of God, and sometimes it costs you personally. But that's all part of being, passionate, having that compassion for the things that God is doing and understanding what God has called you to. And so, when I look at this second instance of him, feeding the multitude, as is typical, it's not just about the people that are being ministered to, but there is such an important lesson here for the disciples. Now, as we close, I just want to skip down to verse 17, which, we'll go through completely next week. But look at what Jesus says, in verse 17, he's starting, a few words in. He says, "Do you not yet perceive nor understand?" He says he is frustrated with the disciples. Jesus is frustrated with them. "Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up?" And they said, 12. And he says also, "When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up?" And they said, 7. And so he said to them, "How is it you do not understand?" You see the miracle in this. You see the provision of God. You see how, God has called you to do something that was so much bigger than yourselves, but God is God. How do you not understand that? Do you not see all of the miracles? Do you not hear all of the things that are being taught? How is that? And we can't jump on Jesus' side here and say, "Man, those disciples, man, yeah, they're frustrated." Because, that's our story. That's how we live. And I'll be honest, Jesus sometimes, I'm sure, is frustrated at us too. You see God move constantly, don't you? You guys cannot tell me that during the course of your life you have not seen God move. You've had miracles. You've seen other miracles. Yet we fail to trust them, don't we? Even when we see signs of the same thing about to happen, something that already has happened. I know with me, the part of this that's aimed at me is finances. My goodness, we have seen so many financial miracles. I've never been on a deathbed, never had anything like that going on in my life, thank God. But my miracles are through provision. I've seen God provide in the most extraordinary ways. And yet still, whenever we get to a place where we have a need, we freak out a little bit. Me and my wife. We're concerned. We're like, oh God, where are you? But we see the same thing happening all the time, over and over. So why do we fail to believe? What's different? What changed? Has God all of a sudden decided that he's not in the provision business anymore? Over and over and over again, we just demonstrate this lack of trust and this lack of faith in God. And that's why he's frustrated at us. Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And you do not remember? Now, last week we talked about that, and we talked about how there are two reasons that people's eyes can't see, and ears can't hear, and hearts can't perceive. We looked at a scripture in Deuteronomy, where basically, Moses is saying, hey, that God has not granted this to you. God has not opened up these spiritual truths to you yet. And so that's the reason why. But in our New Testament context here, that would mean that if you haven't had your ears and your eyes opened and your heart, if it's unable to perceive, that's because you're unsaved. That's because you're not filled with His Spirit. You're not being led by the Spirit of God. I look around the room, we're all saved folks. So that shouldn't pertain to us. We should go on the premise that God has revealed all of these things to us, and all of these truths, all of these spiritual things are available to us because we believe. So the only alternative really is another scripture that we looked at in Ezekiel, where it talked about people not, having ears that don't hear and eyes that don't see because they are rebellious. They're rebellious against God. In other words, they're not listening to God. Now, before you get on the defensive and say, I'm not rebellious, look at it this way. Anytime we take matters into our own hands, we're rebelling against God. Aren't we? God is saying, hey, I've got this covered, follow my plan. And we're saying, no, I'm going to do this on my own strength. No, I've got a better way figured out. No, my way is going to bring more gain, so I'm going to do it this way. We're basically rebelling against God when we do that, when we don't trust Him. Like those disciples out in the boat. The wind is blowing so hard that they're not going anywhere, but they insist on rowing. They're going to keep rowing to get to the other side on their own strength. Nobody's calling out to Jesus. Nobody's trusting God. Nobody's saying, hey, it doesn't make a difference whether we row or not because God has sent us. God said, go to the other side in the boat, and so that means we're going to the other side somehow. We need to trust.